Senate President Courtney, how should the legislature approach reducing correction costs?
Dan, before, Dave, you had a comment on that as well?
And President Courtney may as well. This is an area that I think we have to acknowledge this is really like a third rail. I mean, at least a potential third rail in Oregon politics, maybe national politics. We, in 2009, made some relatively modest changes around earn time and delaying some implementation of one of the Kevin Mannix ballot measures that had passed the previous year. Relatively modest, far more modest than anything that the Reset Cabinet is talking about, and yet dramatically controversial. And this is one that sounds far easier than it actually is. But if you look at where we're spending the dollars, I mean, the dollars that we could be spending on the front end in state troopers or in alcohol and drug treatment or in other places on the early end of life, the early end of the public safety spectrum, as opposed to just saying we're going to lock people up and throw away the key. I think it's bad public policy, but it also is just a tremendous amount of money because the ROI on the dollars we're spending on prisons is basically zero. Whereas the ROI we're spending on state troopers or A&D or a variety of other things is pretty powerful. This is one of those areas, and I think it's also one of the reasons why we've got to look seriously, I hope in 2011, at initiative reform. Because we are stuck in this cycle where we say to voters, do you want to have your cake and eat it too? And I think it's important, we've got to give voters the tools to be able to say, yes, I do want to incarcerate more people for mandatory minimum sentences, even though I know that's going to increase class sizes, or I know that's going to cut state troopers, or that's going to cut alcohol and drug treatment, or that's going to throw people off the Oregon Health Plan. To empower voters with more information like that, I think, is a key step we've got to take so they have the full information to be able to balance the budget just like the legislature does.
Thank you. Senator Courtney, did you have anything?
The prison situation in the state of Oregon has been designed by very few people and basically by the public. 11, 73, 57 versus 61. I can go on and on and on. You have a system. That's why I said earlier in terms of public of Oregon, when you look at term limits, spending limits, even state tax-wide measures, Oregonians will do some remarkable thing. This is an issue that I could go in the tax structure. If the groups in this room and the labor will get together on prison reform with major measures, I suggest we could get control of this thing. Your governor and your legislature by themselves cannot do that. You must understand the magnitude, the number of times the voters have gone to the ballot saying we want this to happen in corrections, and we have to respond to that. There's one last thing no one's talked about here that has me great concern, mental health. We do know that a certain number of people in the correction facilities are mentally ill. We have never really integrated the mental health programs in this state with our correction system in a dynamic way, because if you really want these individuals when they leave to stop doing what they did to get them in there, we're going to have to do much more there. And that is a cost phenomenon that's huge. So I would hope that we would come together as a people, not just the legislature and the governor, to come up with a ballot measure, et cetera. You're going to need to do that. Otherwise, you will never, ever, ever get control of this monster, which basically is eating us up, eating us alive financially, and which, when you look at all the ballot measures, has been defined by the voting public as a result of one or two individuals that will go unnamed that have driven that.
Thank you.
Question is for Congressman Blumenauer, and then maybe we can hear the state perspective also. Congressman, clearly the federal government plays an important role supporting state and local services, but at the same time it imposes a lot of requirements and incents spending to obtain federal matching funds. What should be on the congressional agenda to help Oregon with its fiscal situation?
Well, we are entering a different era. You heard some of my Republican friends talking about eliminating earmarks until actually they won, and now it's their port that they want to dredge and their bridge that they want to build. But it is there will be some fundamental reorientation here. We're in the same 10-year fix that Oregon is in. And I do think that our reset is going to happen much faster. International markets, what's happening just in terms of a frustration with those trend lines that I mentioned. Three things I'd like to see the federal government do. One is to meet its obligations as a full partner for rebuilding and renewing this country. What we did with the Recovery Act in terms of the grid, in terms of infrastructure projects around the state, made a big difference. But we have had languishing the transportation bill. We ought to be able to move forward with that so that we have a blueprint for long-term reinvestment. Secondly, we need to make a transition on the federal level in terms of a performance-based regulatory system. We've been concerned that we've been studying how to clean up a river for, well, since before I went into Congress, Governor Kitzhaber's first term. We've spent who knows how many millions of dollars. We haven't cleaned it up yet. Being able to focus on something that is performance-driven, not undercutting environmental protections. I bleed green. Oregon doesn't want that. But we could make it performance-driven so that as long as we exceeded the environmental standards, we would have more flexibility about how we actually get the job done. The final piece deals with having a rational energy policy. We invest a tiny fraction of a percent on R&D for energy, which is what, Pat, $2 trillion a year, and we saw the problems with that. If we're able to move forward with some of the low-hanging fruit, I mean, literally picking stuff off the ground, having a renewable portfolio standard, having the federal government do its job in energy retrofit so it doesn't have to be a one-off negotiation with a lieutenant colonel at Fort Lame Deer. There are things that we can do building on this success that I think will make a big difference and will ripple throughout the Oregon economy.
Just briefly, what I wish the federal government would do for the state of Oregon is just be a good role model. And, you know, simply put, when you're looking at a role model, you're hoping that they're doing things you wish you could do as well as they are. When you look at our federal deficit, we don't look at the federal government as a role model. There are a number of things that we wish they were doing. It's not happening. But for the state of Oregon, that would be a nice thing. And the next thing that I think our federal delegation, and I'm hopeful because I've heard some good things in the last 2 weeks about this, but it simply ties to our forest management process. How do we get back to doing the things we can do with the resources that we've been blessed to have in this state? And I'd love to see the federal government recognize that that is an issue we knew how to deal with. And if you look at the Oregon Business Plan and you look at the days when we did have per capita income above the national average, you ought to look back and see what the harvest level was in those days as well. So I think there's a few things they could look at and say, here's how we can be a great role model.
And I'm pleased that the very first meeting we had with the governor-elect and the entire delegation, that was one of the things that everybody agreed that ought to be a part of this program going forward in terms of biomass, in terms of forest health. And I think there's bipartisan agreement to do that, and the governor was very clear, and the delegation was united behind him in terms of doing that, working with the administration to try and get some slack cut if we think we've got a plan that'll work.
Thank you.
Okay, last question. We have 2 minutes. We face, what? We face a divided government for the next 2 years. Republicans and Democrats are going to have to make some very difficult decisions together. How would you propose to work together? Anyone can answer this question.
I'll be happy to start. I think we've got some real models of what we can do and what we shouldn't do. One model I would put out there is if you look at the way the Legislative Emergency Board has functioned over the last year. Bipartisan, bicameral, it's basically like the executive committee of the legislature. As the forecasts have continued to decline, the Legislative Emergency Board has come together across party lines and House and Senate lines and identified the places where it's critical that we protect school days, that we protect critical services for needy families, that we protect key public safety services. And it's been amazing to watch in an environment that could have been a food fight, especially since it was happening amidst an election. The emergency board came together and in unanimous vote after unanimous vote after unanimous vote said, here are the common things that we need to protect for Oregon kids and seniors and people with disabilities and needy families and communities. And that kind of model, I think, are exactly the kind of ways that we can work together across those party and bicameral lines.
There are only two politicians' pictures in my office in Washington, D.C., Tom McCall and Mark Hatfield. We've done this in the past, and I am hopeful that there will be an opportunity, because of the magnitude of the challenge that we're facing, that people will be willing to maybe dial down a little bit the toxic and maybe pull back a little bit from the political points that are going to be scored, and look back to those two gentlemen, and they were gentlemen, who really put Oregon first, who really could, and certainly Tom could spout off and really get wound up, but that didn't get in the way of actually doing what the public needed to do. And I'm hopeful that maybe people will look back a little bit in our history, a couple gentlemen like that, that might provide a little bit of a blueprint during some difficult times.
I'll take a shot. It's interesting to me. I'm watching the clock here and mindful of your time, but maybe nowhere more than in the House will this come to fruition. We're looking at history. We're working on history. Our two teams have gotten together and made a decision to work towards co-governance. Those are the issues that have to be dealt with first, to put a body of people together who have been on one side or the other. It's simply put, it will take the leadership of the House, the leadership of the Senate, our new governor, to look at things from a little bit different viewpoint and to put forth legislation that has a much broader appeal to Oregonians than we've seen. Simply said, extreme agenda or ideas from either side will be left out, and we will have to work for the greater good of Oregon, and I see it as a great opportunity.
Let me also chime in on this one. I'm really hopeful as a member of the Senate, where the Republicans are in the minority, but I look at how the Senate president has established the committees and the committee structures, where he's appointed Republicans as chairs of the committees. I think that's an important step, where he has appointed equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats in key legislative committees. Again, an important step. Ultimately, we have significant challenges ahead of us, and we have to work together in order to solve those challenges. I believe that the message that was delivered on November 2nd is one that says having one political philosophy with their hands on all the levers of government perhaps isn't a good thing. And I hope that that message was heard in Salem. I believe it was. The challenges that we face are not Republican or Democrat challenges. There are challenges that we as Oregonians that represent our constituents have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And I'm pleased by how the Senate President has organized the Senate, and I'm hopeful that as we begin on January 10th and then in earnest on February 1st, that I think that the stage that has been set, that we will work together and get the job done.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Let me thank our distinguished panel.